Okay, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building, and I'm excited to be here. And last week I was not here because I was on jury duty, which made me think we should be talking about civic duty. so yes, so that is why today's topic. And because you know what, it's interesting. Most of the people I know don't want to go for jury duty. And then there are some people who get like tons and tons of summons. And yeah, I mean, that's a whole, I don't know, it's something that I don't think about very often. And then, you know, I had never before this past time been actually summoned to appear. I had always received my notification and then called up and they were like, no, we don't need you. So it was the first time I had ever been actually attending the jury selection process, and there is definitely going to be a story coming out of that. Because, gosh, some of the assumptions behind jury selection are really, really fascinating. And troubling. Yeah. So there's that. But yeah. So, I mean, so it was funny because one of the things that came up when I was sitting there was that some people are getting summons more than once a year because, and they were saying, well, it may be because they have your address down twice, once from voter registration and once from your driver's license. And if that is the case, let us know, because you should be receiving summons no more than once a year. But I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, it seems like there should be a system, and they should have a system
a database, right, with deduplication.
Well, I mean, so this all gets complicated by the voter rolls and taxpayers and what happens when people try to make sure that there's only one voter with that name in the database, and that's all a data handling issue, but it also becomes very political because it's closely tied with purging the voter rolls.
Yeah.
And so, on the other hand, I would counsel anybody who's getting an excessive number to look into that, because come the day that they decide to purge the voter rolls, you may look like you are a fraudulent voter. So
yeah,
kind of a thing.
So you don't really want to take people off those lists unless you're really sure. You know.
Well, you know, what parameters are we using for you here?
Yeah.
Representative democracies.
I don't know of any of those.
Yeah, right. Well, we work at
it. Nice idea.
Yeah.
No. Actually, they exist in other places. We've just been told that they're actually a fantasy, and we have the best one, even though it doesn't work very well.
We have the best oligarchy.
Yeah.
So I was on a jury once. In fact, I was a jury foreman. So.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting. The most boring part was 2 days of jury selection because they wouldn't let us bring a book or anything. We had to sit and just listen to endless people trying to get out of being on a jury.
Well, you know, that's interesting because I sat through 2 full days of jury selection, and there were a couple of people who appeared to be really trying to get off the jury. But they went through a lot of people. And a surprising number of them were not actually trying to get off the jury. It wasn't as though they were trying hard to get on the jury, but at the same time, they were very studious about answering their questions. You know?
They thought it was their civic duty if they were selected.
Yeah.
So I hate to be the one to bring up Robert Heinlein, but one of the things in the history of science fiction world building is Starship Troopers, where you can only be a citizen if you serve in the military, right? Which is not quite the civic duty so much as if you want to participate in civics, then you have to do your duty, right? Which the movie sort of attacked, right? Like it kind of went over people's heads, but the movie pulled out the fascist threads of Starship Troopers and put them in the foreground.
Yeah.
And then the American audience just went, oh, cool, giant space bugs and armies. And they were like totally down with the fascism. They didn't notice it. Right?
Yeah, I heard all about that, actually.
Yeah, this is the same group that thinks the stormtroopers are the heroes.
Yeah.
But
I
so
don't know how we ended up with low fashion fascism in the U.S.
Right? I mean, the one good thing about fascism is the uniforms, and here it's like baseball caps and T-shirts. It's just.
How did our uniform become a really ugly red tractor cap?
Yeah, like seriously, right? They're not even issuing them brown shirts.
Yeah, I mean,
okay,
What a budget.
jury duty. Can we go back to jury duty? Yeah, let's go back to jury duty.
Always says that the bad
important.
guys always get the best outfits, but that's clearly not always the case.
It's a key part of our system. Our justice system is supposed to be trial by jury. And you know, let's not get into the jury of your peers thing, because you know it'll take us 2 seconds to say that's not a thing here, and we could spend a whole hour swearing about it.
It is a thing here, depending upon who you are.
Sometimes.
Well, yeah, but that's not the part that I'm thinking about right now. It's why do people work so hard to get out of such an important part of the system?
For the same reason that we work hard to get out of all sorts of things, because we're in a system that does not adequately compensate us when we're doing this, so that we have to take on a lot of hardship when we're already skating on the edge.
It's economic, a lot of it.
For the same reason that people don't take sick days and make all their colleagues sick instead. For the same reason that people who work in restaurants end up passing along nasty, communicable, life-threatening diseases because they can't afford to take the time off. It is because we're not fairly compensated.
Okay, that the only reason?
But so, for example, we were told that we would be reimbursed $15 a day.
A day.
A day.
I got $9 a day, and I had to pay $4 for parking in the jury lot.
So effectively what that ends up doing is that it is the same kind of thing as property taxes funding schools, where we have juries that are only consisting of people that can afford to be on jury duty.
Yep.
And so that means that a jury of your peers only works for people who commit either white collar crimes or are cops. I'm being slightly cynical when I say this, but the level of hyperbole here is pretty small.
Yeah.
No, I understand what you're saying. I was just wondering if that is the only reason for doing that. I mean, I have been called twice, and I have never had to.
You are ardently a believer in civic duty. If you are sufficiently precarious, if you are sufficiently marginalized, you can't afford it. Childcare, lost wages, can you pay your rent?
No, I'm not saying it's not a valid reason or a good reason. I'm just wondering if there are reasons for other people who could afford it.
I just
say, I don't want to do this.
If we're going to discuss that, I want to make sure we're doing it within the confines of that aside, as opposed to pretending that that's not a major issue for a very, very large part of the population.
It is a major issue for a large part of the population. I acknowledge that.
An issue because it is precluding jury of your peers for the kind of people who end up being on trial in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that sweeping that aside is an injustice. I do think that we have a culture that hand in hand has valorized cheating on your taxes and trying to pay as little as possible. Is sort of hand in hand with trying to get out of jury duty, where we've created a deliberately cynical society that says that if you're made to do your part and not do something selfish, that you've been taken advantage of.
Yeah.
So, sort of counteract that, there was. Yeah, I'm just thinking of John F. Kennedy creating the Peace Corps, which again was really only open to kids who were of a certain socioeconomic class, but was an odd sort of civic duty with the idea of the world as the location for civic duty, right? Because I mean, you could do Peace Corps. I think there were domestic projects, but mostly they were overseas. And, you know, so the question is, if you're world building, right, you have to sort of see around the corners, right? Like on the one hand, the Peace Corps is one of the most idealistic things that the United States has ever done. But on the other hand, you could look at it as like, well, it shuts out, you know, the working class, and also it's kind of the good cop part of empire,
Right?
You know, it's a way of looking like you're a very benevolent nation while you're also, you know, bombing villages in Vietnam or whatever.
Sort of a secular missionary program.
It is absolutely a secular missionary program, and it reinforces for people who are not inclined to be doing religious missionary work that we have us, the good guys, and those poor brown people over there. So it is a global tool of racism.
Yet it also, you know, the individual projects might be of benefit, right? So, or not, depending on how ham-fisted they are when they arrive. So,
Yep.
So I guess my point from a world building perspective, to sort of step out of our real world, is that if you try and create anything like a Peace Corps or missionary work or whatever, you have to look at the negatives, right? Like the negatives that wouldn't necessarily be obvious,
right,
to your readers, whoever your readers are, because that's more realistic, right? There's layers of colonialism and post-colonialism and
when there's a lot of power structure
domination.
and
and cats frowning.
I'm really itchy about us having jumped into this frame where we're assuming that the right and proper world building frame is imperialist and colonialist and supremacist and a bunch of other things, and not talking about other forms of civic duty and how service to community can be envisioned in other ways, and that's
just, I think that we just hadn't gotten to that point yet.
Yeah,
I don't think we were going to end up staying there.
We were limiting ourselves to an imperialist, writing about an imperialist system.
Well, I mean, I think
Cliff brought up that.
Wow, we're doing this from a very American place.
Yeah.
We're Americans.
We're starting in American place, but as we like to, we try to go further afield as we go along.
So Cliff did bring up before we started vaccinating your kids as civic duty.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you were in yet for that.
I was.
Oh, you were? Okay, I'm sorry.
I think it's really interesting that in the U.S., vaccinating your children is a very capitalist act.
It's very what? It's very capitalist?
It's a very capitalist act because you have to figure out making sure that you can either pay for it or are compensated for it or have signed yourself up as a person who is incapable of paying for it.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not made easy for people to just do it by rote.
Right.
Because our medical system is kind of screwy, it affects the way we do things. Because we don't have, I mean, there are other cultures that have a civic duty system where there's somebody assigned to your welfare and to knowing what's going on with you and to be able to report that up the government chain so that you don't have to do the self-advocacy. And in that system, the vaccinations just sort of, you know, oh, the home health nurse comes and gives your kid a vaccination or whatever it is. And so I think in the U.S., we make civic duty very difficult to do.
Yes, we do.
There was I don't know if you ever read The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin. One of the world building details is that you have a pharmacy card, and is a kind of a government program where you are benevolently tracked as to your drug use, and if you abuse it, as George Orwell did prior to the opening of the novel, because he was trying not to dream. And you get assigned a psychologist of some sort, right? As some kind of therapist to work with you, rather than, get thrown in jail. And it's this whole system designed to not let people fall through the cracks. And even if they are, it's not a perfect system. It was alternative to what America became. And you could kind of see in the 1970s, you could kind of see America going in that direction, but it didn't. Like Reagan happened, and then it went the other direction.
Yes, in dramatic fashion.
Yes.
So do we consider voting to be civic duty?
Absolutely.
I do.
Yeah.
Well,
And it's another
on the other
thing.
hand, on the other hand, it is part of this whole thing where the U.S. makes it difficult to do.
Yes.
So
we give a whole lot of lip service to civic duty, and the only civic duty that we make easy is military.
Military. Yes.
But we don't reward that in any way.
No.
No, but it's easy.
But it's easy. But it's easy. They are in the high schools. The ASVAB is very easy to arrange to take. There's a lot of recruiting happening for teens. We still have a compulsory draft for men. There are recruiting stations everywhere. If everything else was as easy as joining the military, we would have a very, very different culture.
And
she's totally right.
I wish we would look at Heinlein's envisioned world and think about, if there were other ways of doing civic duty, what would it look like?
So one thing I'd like to talk about is mandatory national service that isn't necessarily military, right? A lot of cultures have that. And it seems to be a very good thing, right? It causes young people to have a sense of responsibility for their nation and to meet people from other backgrounds within their nation and work with them and alongside them, and also to the benefit of them.
What context are you referring to?
Countries that have national service.
Like national military service.
Like Israel.
Not just national military service. There are lots of places that say that if you don't want to pick up a gun, you can transmute your service into other ways.
Yes.
And sometimes it's year for year, and sometimes it's, well, if you're not putting your life at stake, you have to serve a little more, or you're compensated less. And there are ways of handling that, but there are many places where there's just an assumption that if you are a young adult in the transition between your school years and adulthood, you will do national service.
Right. Absolutely. And I know Switzerland is like that as well.
I mean, the only reason I contemplated going into the military at all was because I wanted access to the language institutes at Monterey.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And if I had an option to be trained at government expense to, for instance, speak a refugee processing language, I would have been thrilled to have done that work.
Yeah.
But that's not a thing we fund as a nation. And, as long as we're being American about it, I want to think about this as we go into our next political cycle, because I think it would be amazing if we repurposed things and did that.
Yeah, I agree.
And, I'd still go and do that. I was really, really sad that there was no real way for me to do national service when I was of the appropriate age.
Yeah. I remember registering for the draft, but it was a joke. What happened was I got a letter addressed to me telling me, and with my name and address, telling me that I had turned 18 and I now had to go register, which meant I went to a post office and gave them my name, age, and address. Literally. And I'm like, this is a really good use of government funds to do this on a national level. He says sarcastically.
I know of people who, would have happily objected, but they needed to prove that they were registered for the draft in order to be eligible for various sorts of financial aid and other things. So it's really interesting how we compel that.
Yes. I was talking to someone recently who had decided not to register, and then many years later, he couldn't get a federal grant and get a PhD.
Right. that is a pretty classic thing that I've heard more than once. So, yeah, I mean, I think that we do need to look at why we make it difficult to do national service, and also that in essence, the other thing it does is that people who want to give to community are constrained in the ways that they're allowed to give to community.
Mm.
Mostly it's through churches or through these sort of organizations that are designed for people with wealth and power to form connections with each other.
Mm.
So, other than that, some of the ways that sort of that same impulse comes out is that you watch people becoming camp counselors after they've gone to summer camp. But then you
yeah.
So I don't think we have civic duty as a lifelong ongoing thing as a cultural norm anymore. And I'm kind of curious as to whether it ever existed.
That's an interesting question.
Because I'm a child that came after that cynical generation. So
yeah, I'm not sure.
My impression is that the Vietnam War broke the national will to civic service.
Mm.
But I would want to talk to somebody who was a scholar of the period before I really signed on to that idea.
Yeah.
But it's also been interesting to me to observe because I've watched the way my friends who have religious backgrounds approach this, because for some religious paths, it's very much part of the life expectation at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to speak while there are other people who are actually within Jewishness as opposed to adjacent to it about how that works out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we were to create a list of the things that we've thought of so far, I'm sorry, did you want to say something, Morgan?
No, nothing specific. I was going to start to address the some of the things that are part of community
Mm-hmm.
expectations and duties. But go ahead.
So can I jump in? I'm sorry, I only caught the tail end of what Kat was saying because I had to help my 3-year-old with something. But one thing we haven't considered is, or you've touched on, is the scope of the civic part. Like the duty we've talked about, but like what is the organization to which we owe civic duty? Is it the nation state? Is it the planet? Is it the species? Is it the United Federation of Planets? Is it the city-state of Gondor? Is it, right? Like,
Yeah.
like,
or in the other direction, the very small local groups.
Yeah, like, is it your community if you have like a neighborhood garden, for example?
Sure.
And everyone in the neighborhood is supposed to consider it. What?
Tooks for tooks.
Yes. But also, like Oakland has a number of neighborhood gardens that people in the neighborhood are expected to work on, if they're able. And so, and there's some of my kids go to a grade school, and there are parent volunteer things that are, more or less considered civic duty of the parents to do something during the school year. Maybe it's like I teach what they call Art Vista, which is an art program. There are people who work in the gardens. They're gardeners. I have too many allergies, but there are a lot of people who are they're a lot gardening, and other things. And then there are people who just give donations. The music program at my kid's school is funded entirely from the PTA donations, basically. Because it's a public school.
Yeah, and I suppose PTA and parent teacher clubs and that kind of thing are a form of civic duty, just because they're a support structure for the school.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can argue that, and I would argue that the schools are insufficiently supported by the system that as it was set up, which is something that Kat alluded to earlier. That it's very, very uneven, and even parent-teacher clubs are not solving the problem because they're all locally based.
Well, also, if you have to have a certain amount of privilege to give time to your school.
Right.
The PTO is a mechanism for concentrating privilege in the U.S.
What is?
The PTOs, PTAs, all these teacher associations, which, you know, I'm not sure why we even say teacher in them, because it really means parents of leisure, of some sort. It really is a method of concentrating resources to only those schools which have parents who can come in and expend that time and effort. I mean, I know of kids who are going to schools where the PTO raises enough money that every kid gets an iPad. I mean, and there are PTOs that are working to just make sure the heat stays on. And so,
yeah,
it's a way of hiding how inadequately we fund our schools.
Yep.
And so I feel like our civic duty in the U.S. is just really, really completely entwined with exactly how pervasively we have codified and formalized inequity. So,
yeah, I think there's a lot of value placed on charity and not enough placed on duty in terms of just supporting, setting up systems that will adequately support everyone in the community versus, well, everybody in the community is doing so badly, so I'm going to make myself feel good by coming in and awarding some great thing to one or two kids.
The other interesting thing that's happening right now is that organizations that are working to feed the homeless, for instance, are getting criminalized.
Yeah.
And so there are people attempting to perform, I guess you'd call it extra civic duty, are being penalized because it's not sufficiently constrained within the governmental strictures.
Which are inadequate.
Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have this really terrible hybrid of food safety regulations and you can't give food away.
Yeah.
And the rationale is that you can't give food away because what if you poison somebody? But the reality is that it's also used to just criminalize actual charitable food giveaways.
Yeah.
So I think that as people who are writing secondary worlds or writing near futures or the past, it's important for us to look at what function is actually being served. I think is the basic thing that we've been touching on over and over in this episode is the world actually designed the way that we as the creator of the world intend it to be? Mm-hmm. Or are we recreating things that we're used to that we haven't examined enough? So,
well, that's always the world building question, isn't it?
Yeah.
On so many levels.
But yeah, I really find it interesting what we consider civic duty and what we don't, and also that we don't make it easy enough to do what I consider the fundamental civic duty of democracy, which is to be informed enough to be able to help make decisions. I mean, it used to be that you couldn't get the information unless you had a newspaper subscription or unless you had a television of some sort. I mean, we put in all sorts of interesting economic barriers.
Yeah.
So, sorry, apparently I'm even rantier than usual today.
No, but it's all very relevant.
There were so many on-topic rants.
There we go. Well, I mean, a lot of the way this works grows out. I mean, I suppose this is almost unnecessary to say, but you got to say it. The way that it works grows out of the culture that it's coming from. You know, sometimes I have thought about the way that, for example, kids in elementary school in Japan are participating in cleaning the school.
Right.
And I think about that and I go, wow, that's really cool. But you couldn't do it here because it would suddenly become, well, my rich kid is going to find a way to get out of it while the poorer kids in the school end up being everybody's janitors.
Right.
Right. So the way that something becomes operationalized is actually very dependent on a lot of fundamental values in how the culture is put together.
I find it really interesting that my Australian friends found it really horrifying that the only thing we take away from our voting days is the little stickers.
Yeah.
Because they are all very, very used to, they call it democracy sausage.
Yes.
There's always a grill going at the polling places, and
well, the grill at the polling places is not directly related to the polling places. It's more like the local group having a bake sale.
Well, it is, but it's allowed on the premises, and I don't think that's actually allowed for us.
Yeah, sure.
And in addition, it's really interesting because where their polling places are is not necessarily the same as ours. I mean, they are at schools, but I think they open other commercial places more often.
Yeah.
And the other thing I love is that you can track social trends in the Australian demographics by where there are vegetarian offerings at the grills and vegan offerings at the grills and halal offerings.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
And gluten-free offerings. And it's a demographic response to who's coming to vote. And I sort of think about, I did a whole survey during the last election about how many languages were on your I voted sticker by municipality, because I come from one that has a lot of languages.
Sure.
Especially LA has like 17 languages or something the last time I looked. It's probably inaccurate now, but imagining what the democracy sausage would look like in a place with 17 languages. I mean, would it all be hot dogs, or would you suddenly have an interesting array of what Anthony Bourdain used to call meat in tube form?
Meat in tube form.
Well, that's a lovely simile. Evocative.
Also, while we're talking about it, I want to kind of skip frame and talk about the ways that we've now, at least in the U.S., come away from an expectation that it's a civic duty to get married monogamously, heterosexually, and have children.
Yeah, okay.
And in many places, it's still considered civic duty, and in various countries that fall below replacement numbers for populations, governments decide it's a civic duty to breed, and there's infamous.
That's kind of appalling.
Albania.
And in China, it was a civic duty for women to have only one child for a long time.
So
yeah,
but it was by women specifically, right? Like a guy could get married, divorced, and marry and have another kid. That would be fine.
Yeah.
Standard.
Interesting to look at what's considered a civic duty, what's considered a religious duty,
Mm-hmm.
and where the lines blur and where they don't. And now I wish we had a Rome expert around. And where's Brian Dalton when we need him?
I know, man.
Yeah.
Come on, Brian.
I was thinking of it, but I don't know enough to.
So, here's a question for you. In late stage capitalist societies, such as the United States of America, is buying things a civic duty? Spending money during the Christmas season, for instance?
No. It's not. It doesn't benefit the state. And it doesn't
taxation, sales tax.
Well, I mean,
that's
yeah.
Because one of the ways Gandhi struck back at the British was to have people, make their own clothes, spin their own cotton, make their own clothes.
Right.
Which got out of that system.
Well, yeah. Okay. I guess it reminds me of boycotting, and I don't think that boycotting is related to civic duty.
Boycotting is not, but he was trying to break a system.
general strikes and boycotting aren't civic duty, but they're definitely the flip side, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's withdrawing yourself from the system. I was
So
also
if,
thinking about like the whole community garden ethos is really interesting because I did not know until relatively recently that the allotment system in England is a specific historic thing, and that it's very codified. And in the US, it's kind of unusual to have a community garden space available to people. It's a perk, and there are other cultures that have turned it into a right, which I just find amazing. It's not guaranteed every citizen gets one, but you can get on the waiting list and you can try to get in. And we've made it a civic duty to educate our children, where there was a time in the US when it was not compulsory.
Yeah.
And there's still
that's true.
And there's still issues around what kind of private school you send your kid to. Are you taking them out of the compulsory institutionalized system? People often think that going to church is a civic duty.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Those of us who come from people who are not amongst the mainstream religions are very acutely aware of what it's like to be on the wrong end of that.
Yeah.
Also, tithe, as a civic duty in Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Oh, tithing, yeah.
Tithing, 10% of everything goes to the church.
Which church are you not attending? Also,
where was the oh shoot, where was it that they I think it might have been France, where tithe was part of your taxes, and they had to create a system for opting out for people who were not part of the religion.
I know that the Germans still have some things about whether or not there's a church associated that automatically gets a cut of what you make.
Yeah.
At least that's my understanding. My apologies to the Germans if I've gotten it wrong.
Right, exactly. My apologies to France if I've gotten it wrong.
I'm also thinking about now I've lost my train of thought. Oh, recycling.
Oh, yeah.
Trash disposal and what you do with your water. And, as Californians, there's a whole sense of what do you do during drought time? And
yes,
in the upper Midwest, I was just asked not to wash my dishes or run my dishwasher or shower because the drains were going to be so overloaded with melting snow.
Wow.
Is a civic duty kind of thing. And wow, that was, it's very much like the California drought thing. But, there'd been days of perhaps you shouldn't be doing the dishes because your pipes are challenged, and trying to do clothes washing when the drainage is getting iffy and basements and other places are kind of cold was an issue anyway. And then it got warm and people going, oh yay, now I'm going to, well, no, don't do that.
I see.
Well, there was also a time in the previous century in many communities in America where parenting was kind of a civic duty. Like if other kids, because kids were running free, and if they were misbehaving in public, then any adult's duty was to discipline the kid.
Yeah.
As opposed to
that's definitely gone away.
Yes.
Civic duty now appears to be keep your hands off of other people's children, no matter what they're doing.
I think something that
Kat's like, well, not always. Not always is definitely pretty much true of everything I say.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what happens
not always.
We run into culture clashes.
Yeah.
Because if you're disciplining somebody else's child, there's no guarantee that the child is misbehaving, or that you perceive as misbehaving, is of the same cultural guidelines, rules.
Sure.
Yeah, cultural clashes in expectations of behavior, and also in expectations of civic duty.
Yeah,
right?
all across the board. Difference in religion, difference in culture, difference in governments that you grew up with. And you put all of those people in the same square mile, and then expect all of that to run smoothly. And it takes focus, and it takes understanding and communication, and that doesn't, you have to mean to make it work. You have to intend for it to work. You have to care. And you have to understand that even learning to communicate and ask the right questions is not easy.
Right.
Well,
sorry.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that there is this kind of sense that we get of this sort of the character of a nation or the character of a government system that is built up out of lots of little tiny parts. And the parts, as we've seen, tend to kind of pattern together and reflect underlying trends in the culture. But I think it's really interesting to sort of think of how there are all these little tiny pieces of what makes up, say, a community in, this particular place that I live in California within the United States versus the kinds of things that would build up in other areas. And I have a certain degree of fascination with complex systems, right? But what ends up happening that I find really interesting is that there's a kind of character that comes out of the aggregation of all of those different details, right?
I was thinking about the norms of interpersonal interactions as you walk down a sidewalk, for instance, the difference between the way New Yorkers will do it as opposed to infamously in places like Minnesota or the South, where the social cohesion is more about interaction as opposed to sort of not minding your own business and getting out of the way as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And also local driving cultures.
Yes.
And I think that kind of has the same kind of flavor of civic duty. And I'm once again back at recycling, where coming from where I do and from the background my parents came from, where the Japanese are one of the most intense recycling cultures in the world.
Yeah.
I am currently living in a situation where I'm not supposed to recycle my plastic, and I'm really troubled by this.
Yeah, that would trouble me as well.
Jugs and jugs of milk, and I
go nuts.
Go into the dairy culture another time, but really, that's supposed to go into the dumpster. That really hurts.
Yeah.
So
that I'm not going to do that.
Which reminds me of constructed civic duties, where somebody, either a government body or a corporation or a neighborhood, deliberately attempts to create and maintain a civic duty. And I was thinking of anti-littering campaigns in the 1970s, when environmentalism came into being in the 1960s. And one result of that was that all of a sudden the government was interested in telling you not to be a litter bug, and doing it with the famous commercial of the Native American who wasn't a Native American crying. And before that, I remember the sides of freeways were very much full of trash before that.
Well,
and by the end of the 70s, there was noticeably less trash on the sides of the freeway. Not gone, but people started looking askance at people who were litter, like it was a big deal.
The opportunity to sponsor a stretch of roadway.
Yes.
Oh yes.
Yes.
But it's funny that you mentioned the fake Indian, Cliff, because my strong impression is Woodsy Owl and give a hoot, don't pollute. And
I remember that iconic commercial of him just standing there and looking with the tear, single tear.
Yeah.
I remember Woodsy Owl. Absolutely. And, only you can prevent forest fires. Smokey Bear. But another.
It's interesting. So, you know, it's like this is another really interesting question to ask if you're creating a secondary world, to say, what interest does the government have in controlling your behavior and why, right? And I think one of the is like, so take, for example, let's go back to Australia for a bit, right? But I think it would work in not just Australia. Australia is the one I'm most familiar with. Australia has a national health system.
Mm-hmm.
And they can save their national health system a lot of money if they discourage smoking.
The current one in Australia is they're doing a lot of work around depression. And so there are statewide helplines funded by the government for depression counseling services. I think it's called Think Blue, which was really confusing to me coming from a context where blue tends to mean police. But
oh dear,
I was thinking, you know, Democrats, but okay, yeah.
That too. I mean, they have
well, you know, colors are useful for so many things.
So depressed cop Democrats can call this.
But there were signs up all over all of the train platforms, you know, letting you know that you can call these people. I have seen suicide hotline information in Chicago, but it's a little more, please don't jump on the train, on the tracks rather. So
yeah.
Hey,
there's also France has an anti-soda campaign that many people I have seen find absolutely appalling.
Well, that's only because the French didn't invent soda, right? I mean,
no, I don't think so. I think they have other reasons behind it, but I haven't gone and spoken to the government departments in question.
I was being facetious. So
we've turned the straw ban into a civic duty issue culturally.
Yeah,
a bit recently.
Yeah.
It's interesting how these things take off.
Sure. Yeah. A couple of other examples I wanted to make sure I got in because I wrote down that aren't necessarily connected.
Yeah.
One is the Amish. The community gets together and builds a barn when there's a new house.
Oh yeah, barn building. Yeah.
Barn building is a civic duty of able-bodied Amish people for their neighbors. And then there was a Star Trek episode that more or less only works as an allegory, but works very well for the atomic age, was the one in which there are the two planets at war, and they were using simulated fusion bombs, and civic duty was to walk into a disintegration chamber if they were killed by a simulated fusion bomb. Oh yeah. Right? You know, and Kirk and company basically become terrorists and blow up a disintegration booth with a phaser, you know, and then eventually blow up the battle computer. But it was absolutely, you know, death was a civic duty. So one thing you could explore in a made-up society, or I don't know, the Aztecs, right? You know, situations in which death is a civic duty. Okay. Human sacrifice, or, you know, for political reasons or religious reasons, or I mean, in our culture, death is a civic duty for soldiers, but, you know, most people it's not. But it's
well, and it is and it isn't, right? I mean, because we can say, well, yeah, sure it is, but at the same time, people who go to sign up for the military are not signing up to die.
No, but you might get a mission
people
where
do say that about them.
Yeah,
it's kind of appalling, right? But when nobody should have to expect that, well, I've signed up for the military, that means that automatically I should expect that this is going to end in my death.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yet there were times where, you know, like World War I, where they didn't expect it initially, but later people, you know, they kind of expected it. Sure. If you're towards the end of the war, word had gotten back that the survival rate was appallingly low.
So. Yeah, well, yeah.
And if you were a Roman, I do know one bit of Roman history.
Okay, give us Roman history, and we'll wrap
if you
up.
wanted to be if you were a particularly cowardly legion, if you were found to be cowardly, you could get decimated.
Okay.
And what that was that 1/10 of you by lot died, and the other 9 had to kill you in your own unit. It was a punishment. So it was your civic duty to not only kill the 10th guy who got the short star, but to die as the 10th guy, to redeem the honor of your legion. Which is where we get the word decimate, 1/10.
Yeah, but we don't use it that way anymore.
Yeah, we do not.
You could leave it to me, Kat, to end everything on a positive note. Hey, 90% of them lived. Come on.
Yeah.
It's a happy occasion. No.
I was kind of hoping to end on Tikkun Olam myself. But
Well, do it.
Yeah, Tikkun Olam is a very
Tikkun Olam
good.
is a beautiful place to end. End with Tikkun Olam.
Mm-hmm.
For those following along at home, it means the repair of the world. The idea is that God left the world unfinished, and it is humanity's job to finish this work.
Oh, interesting.
But it is no individual's job to finish the work. The expectation is that you do not finish it in your lifetime, but you're not allowed to shirk the responsibility just because you don't expect to see it finished.
Yeah. Which
Anything you wanted to add to that, Kat? Because I don't want to step on you.
No, mostly it's just that social justice is a cultural value is different from a culture where the cultural value is based on the status quo.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
Of world building.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's a very good point, right? Tikkun Olam is opposed to the status quo.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
So, and that's built into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so we're in a culture where activism is literally part of the value of the culture.
Yeah. And also, you know, the idea that you're not shouldering the whole load yourself.
Yes.
Yes.
I think maybe we feel also, okay, so this is not helpful. I had a thought, but I think it's not helpful. But I think in some ways that many people feel that contributing to some kind of concept of progress is a civic duty. Now, I don't know if it's a civic duty. That's the part where I'm like, well.
That's a really big cultural divide in the U.S. currently right now, and also globally.
Yeah.
Between people who are like, no, we need to get back to traditional la la la, and other people saying, no, we need to move away from traditional. So
it depends on whether utopia is in the past or the future for you.
Also, what tradition you're talking about. You know, the tradition that some cultures have or have had in the past where women have the right to decide what to do with their property or their bodies. You know, I'd like to get back to those traditions. Not an American tradition ever, but, you know, it'd be a nice one.
Yeah.
It's a good idea. We should try it sometime.
We do need to wrap up, you guys.
Yeah. So let's go back to Tikkun Olam.
I don't know. I think now that Dive into World Building is back, we should just totally like talk all night.
Well, Dive into World Building is part of Tikkun Olam.
Fundraising marathon all night talk.
That's right. The Dive into World Building marathon. I'm a little frightened to imagine it.
Yeah, hour 23.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. This was very interesting. I thought it went to really interesting places. And let's see. I can go back and look at my topic list. I was thinking progress might be a really interesting topic for an occasion. You know,
could start with Tikkun Olam and move on from there.
Maybe.
I don't know. I'm suddenly going, you know, let's talk about sinkholes, but
let's talk about sinkholes, okay? Fine.
I like that.
All right. But
how about world building like planets?
And you guys are amazing, and I really appreciate you. So I'm going to stop the broadcast.